One of the atomic reactors at the Chernobyl atomic power plant near the city of Kiev was damaged, and there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're looking at the greatest historical, financial, and technological blunders of all time.
There were witchcraft outbreaks all the time, all through the colonies, especially the northern colonies.
The Exxon Valdez oil spill.
They were completely overwhelmed. Coast Guard didn't quite know what to do.
Before Deepwater Horizon, the Exxon Valdez oil spill was the largest in American history, dumping more than 10 million gallons into Alaska's Prince William Sound. But this accident is far less complex and is attributed almost entirely to human error. Shortly after midnight on March 24, 1989, the tanker ran aground on Bligh Reef, puncturing 8 of its 11 cargo holds.
When we got on the radio, he said, "Well, how big's the hole?" I said, "Well, it's big enough to drive our boat through."
At the time, Captain Joe Hazelwood was below decks, sleeping off, quote, 2 or 3 vodkas he had consumed earlier. Furthermore, the crew was overworked and exhausted, contributing to third mate Gregory Cousins driving the vessel into the reef. Part of the blame also reportedly lay on the Exxon Shipping Company for failing to maintain the ship's collision avoidance system.
You can see oil like a boiling cauldron.
Mexico attacks the Alamo.
If you could oversee manning the walls, it would be a help. We should have 6 men to a cannon, 18 tubes, which works out to
108 men.
And we should have a man with a musket every 4 feet of wall.
We're gonna need more men.
In 1836, the Texas Revolution was underway, with the Anglo-American residents of Texas fighting for independence from the Mexican Republic. They were successful, winning 10 years of independence before joining the United States in 1846. During the war, Mexican forces under General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna laid siege to the Alamo.
You said you wanted to see him. There he is. The Napoleon of the West.
Which one? That's Santa Anna.
Yeah.
He's quite the peacock, isn't he?
After 13 days, roughly 1,500 Mexican soldiers launched a decisive attack, overwhelming the garrison of about 200 Texians after 3 attempts. It was a Pyrrhic victory, though, as the merciless bloodshed inspired many to join the army, hoping to take revenge for the loss of their fellow Texians. Mere weeks later, a now fortified Texian army attacked the Mexicans by surprise in the Battle of San Jacinto, decimating them in just 18 minutes.
At this very moment, our soldiers are held in the Alamo against a force of thousands. They put their hopes in Colonel Fannin, who, despite his pedigree, has proven himself ill-equipped to lead, much less march an army. This is from Colonel Travis. I call on you in the name of liberty to come to our aid with all dispatch.
Byzantine refusal to hire Orban.
Praise to all of you, Engineer Urban.
Thank you, my Sultan.
Have a safe journey.
The Roman Empire's final 2 centuries were their most difficult. By 1452, the Ottoman Empire already had its eyes on Constantinople, which prompted Hungarian siege engineer Orban to offer his cannons to the Romans. Unfortunately, they couldn't afford his services or provide the materials needed to construct his weapons. So, Orban took his business to the Ottomans, who happily took him on.
Free from misfortune! Do not fail us in our mission! Let our courageous soldiers be victorious on the battlefield!
He crafted the Basilic, one of the largest cannons in history, requiring 90 oxen and 400 men to transport it. Its cannonballs, each weighing 1,200 pounds, devastated the Theodosian walls, which were impenetrable for about 800 years prior. The Ottoman Sultan also carried warships across the land, bypassing the harbor's Great Chain and giving them another huge advantage.
Somebody hold the rope! Tuck the ship! Come on!
Heavy submarines. Maybe they're designed to reach astonishing depths, but that's no good if your submarine is incapable of surfacing again. That's exactly what happened to the doomed Isaac Peral class of Spanish submarine when designers realized that somebody at some point had carelessly left a decimal point in the wrong place. The sub was 100 tons heavier than it should be, meaning that if it submerged, it would never be able to return to the surface. Thankfully, the sub hadn't yet been built, so the schematics were changed to make it longer and capable of supporting all that extra weight. Except then there was another problem. The sub was now too large to fit into the port where it was being constructed. New Coke. In 1985, about a century after Coca-Cola first hit shelves, Coke decided to mix things up and rework the tried-and-tested Coke formula.
Yeah, Coke is it. Come on, check it out now.
The result was New Coke, one of the biggest marketing fails and disasters of all time. The simple fact was that nobody really liked New Coke. Coke wanted to make its drink taste more like Pepsi, which is a little sweeter than Coke, and it was a resounding failure.
All the taste tests said people preferred the taste of this new product to the century-old product. What they hadn't factored in was the huge emotional attachment there was to this brand.
Though we understand trying to corner Pepsi's share of the market, consumer capitalism is about choice. Nobody wants to choose from two identical colas.
It's a Coke. Coke is it.
There was just no reason for Coke to try and destroy its own business by changing the recipe. Inaccurately describing the Zodiac Killer. The self-named Zodiac Killer held Northern California in a state of terror in the late 1960s. The serial killer taunted police by sending multiple letters and ciphers to the local press.
The killer contacts local press. He includes a strange three-part coded message or cipher.
Zodiac eluded authorities for a year before narrowly escaping capture in 1969. After shooting San Francisco taxi driver Paul Stein, Zodiac was able to flee the scene because the physical description provided to police officers over dispatch was wrong.
That they may have said something like, the man's wearing a black jacket or black pants. And somehow the dispatcher misheard this and then repeated they were looking for a black man instead of a white man.
This mistake enabled Zodiac to walk directly by two police officers who unwittingly allowed the killer to escape. Investigators did not connect the shooting to Zodiac until the San Francisco Chronicle received a letter from the killer bragging about the murder and his close brush with the officers. Pickett's charge. Confederate General Robert E. Lee made the biggest mistake of his life on July 3, 1863, when he ordered his troops to charge on Cemetery Ridge. There were several flaws in Lee's plan. Union General George G. Meade had anticipated Lee's attack on the center of his lines rather than the flanks and concentrated his defenses there.
Now Pickett gave the order. Up, men, and to your posts. Don't forget today that you are from Old Virginia.
The charge exposed Confederate soldiers to heavy artillery and rifle fire, and the Army suffered catastrophic casualties. It effectively crippled the Confederate forces at Gettysburg and forced Lee to abandon the battle and retreat from the North. With this one simple charge, the tide of the American Civil War permanently shifted, all to the detriment of Lee and his forces.
What's happening? I can't see what's happening to my boys. What's happening to my boys?
The Wangongchang explosion. Gunpowder has been used by China since the 9th century.
Early Chinese alchemists were trying to create a potion for immortality. Instead, what they created was a flammable powder that burned down many of their homes.
Despite centuries of use and refinement, Beijing officials were criminally negligent in the spring of 1626. It never seemed to occur to anyone in power that the center of a densely populated city wasn't the best choice for storing volatile materials. Late on the morning of May 30th, for reasons which remain unclear, the Wangongchang armory exploded. Everything within 4 square kilometers was all but obliterated, and debris was launched across the length of the city. Somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 people were killed, and large swaths of the city were utterly destroyed. Jong Nam goes to Tokyo Disneyland.
Why would the young dictator of North Korea want to kill his own brother? Well, to understand North Korea, you really have to think of it as being an absolute monarchy, the Kim dynasty. The dynasty was founded by Kim Il-sung after the Second World War. And when the old man died in 1994, his son, Kim Jong-il, ascended the throne.
Jong Nam was once the heir to the North Korean dictatorship until 2001 when he made an embarrassing attempt to visit Tokyo Disneyland. Traveling on a fake Dominican Republic passport bearing a Chinese name, Kim was arrested upon arrival in Japan and deported to China. The incident deeply embarrassed his father, Kim Jong-il, and caused him to be shunned by his family. Ultimately, his younger half-brother Kim Jong-un took over from their father. In 2017, Kim was assassinated in Malaysia, and it was later revealed that he had been a CIA informant.
Why he killed? You don't know? Because his power is not stable. Last time Kim Jong-il, his father, he never killed people. But now, I don't think so. That's why he killed all the people. He cannot trust the people, right?
He also supported reform and free market policies, which apparently contributed to him being passed over. Had he never attempted that fateful trip, perhaps North Korea's trajectory might have been different.
After Jang Sang-tae executed it, killed it, after that, 1 year, 1.5 years, only one time. I saw him. I was waiting for him, but he never came. It means his situation completely changed, be dangerous, and then the suffering for the money.
Circulating inaccurate suspect sketches. It's been over 135 years since Jack the Ripper stalked the streets of London's Whitechapel district. But the infamous murderer continues to enthrall the public.
In the autumn of 1888, the East End of London lived in terror.
Beginning in August 1888, the killer claimed 5 lives in a vicious spree that is still widely discussed and debated. As publicity mounted about the killings, police struggled under mounting pressure from the press.
They were under a lot of pressure to solve these cases, identify this individual.
In an attempt to elicit help from the public, police made a critical error when they allowed the press to publish artist renderings of the killer. Unfortunately, the sketches were not based on witness descriptions. They were simply the artist's interpretation of how a deranged killer may look. The drawings resulted in a flood of useless tips, further straining the already overwhelmed detectives.
Even at the time of the murders, he was becoming mythology. And then you start getting the man with the top hat and the cape and the little bag, so he's almost being given a supervillain image that people can latch onto.
Ronald Wayne sells out.
You know that when people hear your story, they say to themselves, my gosh, $22 billion, he could have had it.
What can I say?
Hindsight is 20/20, which is why this error stings so much. Back in 1976, businessman Ronald Wayne met Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and initially thought they had something with their fledgling computer company. Wayne went in with 10% stake in Apple, but it wasn't to last. Less than 2 weeks on, and he'd lost faith, selling those shares back to the company's founders.
If I had stayed with Apple, I probably would have wound up the richest man in the cemetery.
As we all know, Apple went on to become one of the biggest companies and electronic manufacturers in the entire world, with over 1 billion active iPhones as of 2021. What we wouldn't give for a time machine to the 70s so we could invest in the Apple shares Ron Wayne gave up.
I knew exactly what would have been if I'd have stayed with the company. I would have wound up heading a very large documentation department at the back of the building, shuffling papers for the next 20 years of my life, and that was not the future that I saw for myself.
Wrong trains. We've seen submarines too big for their ports, but what about trains too wide for their platforms? That's what happened in France in 2014 when France's national rail company SNCF put in an order for 2,000 brand new trains. The trains would fit many big metropolitan stations like Paris's newer infrastructure. But in rural France, the platforms were too narrow. This all happened because somebody at the French rail network gave SNCF the wrong measurements.
The reason that they've got this problem is because RFF, which is the rail network operator, had measured platforms and stations that were built about 30 years ago, and the access between the platforms looked about right.
SNCF was left trying to secretly widen the affected stations, but eventually the error was made public. The trains themselves cost around $20 billion, and modifying the platforms has cost over $60 million.
Investors are indignant about the mistake. We refuse to pay a single cent for these repairs, said this spokesperson. We can't be taken for fools and pay for the privilege.
The Deepwater Horizon oil spill.
126 people were on board at the time of the explosion.
Some jumped more than 75 feet into the ocean.
A multitude of factors went into the Deepwater Horizon explosion and oil spill. A central mistake was the failure to correctly respond to the signs of impending disaster. Pressure tests indicated that the well was not properly sealed, but the readings were misinterpreted.
Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Deepwater Horizon. We've had a major explosion. We need assistance.
This error was compounded by a rush to complete the drilling operation, driven largely by cost-cutting pressures, leading to the decision to proceed with the operation despite warning signs. The sequence of failures ultimately triggered the calamitous explosion that killed 11 people and sent 210 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Mexico.
Meanwhile, live cameras on the ocean floor show the ferocity of the ongoing leak.
Star Wars billions. In the mid-70s, nobody knew that Star Wars was going to become one of the biggest pop culture properties in history.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Production was expensive, difficult and ran George Lucas into the ground. Not seeing its potential, 20th Century Fox made a deal with Lucas that he'd receive the royalties from merchandise sales. What followed set a new standard for merchandisable franchises, giving Lucas a personal fortune to the tune of billions of dollars. It was a grave error on the part of Fox, and saw the studio miss out on an absolutely obscene amount of money in the decades between Star Wars release in theaters and Lucasfilms being acquired by Disney.
You have lost.
No. 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 You must die!
Angering Genghis Khan.
You still sing the same song, Temujin.
Many voices carry it now.
Not the Merkits. Outcast.
I asked for this meeting in the hope that Mongol would not shed Mongol blood. Also that you might still join with me to spread the name of the Mongol nation.
Many words can be used to describe Genghis Khan, one of history's most successful conquerors, but cool-headed isn't one of them. In less than 2 years, Genghis annihilated the Khwarezmian Empire. While there were a variety of factors that contributed to this invasion, the main one was an insult to his ambassadors.
I promise you this, Jamuda. The Merkits will ride as part of the Mongol nation, or their land will be razed to the ground. Raised so that not even a lame horse would stumble walking across it.
In 1218, the Khan sent a caravan to the empire, who were arrested and executed on suspicion of being spies. When Genghis sent diplomats to deal with the situation, the Khwarezmians refused to comply and beheaded the chief envoy. By 1221, their empire was shattered, and they had suffered somewhere between 2 and 15 million casualties. Maybe think twice before you insult one of history's most ambitious conquerors.
I have lived to see it. That the tribes come together as one people. But it is my sons who will make our nation great.
Napoleon invades Russia.
I must wipe away my melancholy and begin the march to Moscow. I've convinced the heads of Europe of this resolution, and so I command the combined forces of France, Austria, Italy, Germany, and Poland. I see nothing but success in my future.
In 1812, Napoleon famously declared war on Russia, citing their refusal to comply with the continental system. He brought around 500,000 soldiers from all across Europe to the border and proceeded to march them to Moscow. The Russian defense was confused with no planned resistance, with their eventual scorched earth tactic being largely improvised.
I'm writing to you because I've just won a great battle today. Tomorrow we will resume our advance. Moscow is now only 200 miles away, and I think of you all the while. All yours.
At the Battle of Borodino, Napoleon abandoned his usual cunning tactics and ordered a direct assault instead. The French won and Moscow was taken, but Little Boney never received the peace deal he expected. Eventually, winter took hold, and Napoleon embarked upon one of history's most disastrous retreats, costing him his army and ultimately his empire.
Fortune has abandoned me. I know that it is what fate has for me. Your words rattle in my head. I am nothing without you.
Forgetting about time zones hamstrung the Bay of Pigs invasion. During the Cold War, the U.S. backed numerous coups d'etat around the world. While several of these succeeded in installing new regimes, attempts in Cuba failed spectacularly. Worried about Prime Minister Fidel Castro's communist policies, in 1961, the CIA orchestrated the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion, landing Cuban counter-revolutionaries on the country's southwestern coast. However, an obvious paint job on a B-26 bomber, disguised to look Cuban, gave away U.S. involvement to the world, leading President Kennedy to pull back air support. A few days later, a last-ditch bombing raid flying out of Nicaragua was botched when bombers were caught without their escort of fighter jets. Embarrassingly, someone had forgotten the 1-hour difference between Nicaragua and Cuba, the Cedar Fire.
It's gigantic. You never imagine it's as big as that. Until it happens.
Imagine accidentally starting a fire that burns over 270,000 acres of land and kills 15 people. The guilt would be unimaginable. Sergio Martinez was a novice hunter who got lost in the Cuyamaca Mountains of Southern California in October 2003 and started a fire to signal potential rescuers.
Afraid he was going to die in the wilderness, he finally set a signal fire which got out of control.
But the flames quickly spread to the nearby chaparral, and he lost control of the fire. The low humidity and Santa Ana winds exacerbated the destruction, and the fire burned through 273,000 acres of San Diego County. Nearly 3,000 buildings were destroyed and 15 people lost their lives. Martinez was given 5 years probation and 960 hours of community service.
If you take a look down Fairbrook here, Fairbrook Place, this is just something you'd probably see in a movie. That's the only way to describe it.
Attempting to force a confession. The grisly 1947 murder of Elizabeth Short is one of the most notorious cold cases in American history. Dubbed the Black Dahlia by the media because of her dark hair and affinity for black clothing, Short was a young, aspiring actress.
She was a young woman who left her home to come find fame and fortune, maybe, in Los Angeles.
The case was heavily publicized. By most accounts, the LAPD put extensive effort into solving the case, conducting numerous interviews and identifying multiple suspects. However, they faced intense public pressure to capture the killer.
Police and reporters try to get a lead on Beth's life, but the more they dig in, the more of a mystery she becomes.
When they narrowed in on Leslie Dillon, investigators were certain he was responsible. Trying to force a confession from Dillon, the LAPD's gangster squad illegally detained him. In response, Dillon filed a lawsuit against the department. The case ultimately landed in front of a grand jury and then went cold.
The Elizabeth Short mystery carries on to this day because nobody's been caught.
Quaker buys Snapple. In the early 90s, Snapple was only on the up. It had a few high-profile ad campaigns that meant it was able to hold its own in the competitive world of juice and soft drinks, making it look like a promising investment opportunity for Quaker Oats.
Quaker Oats doesn't come with prizes. But there's something in this box that I think is really worth prizing.
Unfortunately, things did not go to plan. Though Quaker Oats spent $1.7 billion on a deal it thought was a sure thing, after only 3 years, Snapple was sold off again so that Quaker Oats could lick its wounds for a meager $300 million.
Here's some iced tea to pass the time, but remember, nothing takes the place of a good education.
Perhaps a little embarrassingly, Snapple is still going strong. It seems that separating was the best thing for both of these brands.
Snapple, made from the best stuff on earth.
The 2024 CrowdStrike incident.
It's hit transport, with air passengers and their luggage having to be manually processed, delaying flights. Trains have also been affected.
Before July 19, 2024, few people had ever heard of CrowdStrike. It's amazing how much damage just one day can do. CrowdStrike is a cybersecurity company based out of Austin, Texas that caused about $10 billion in damage on the morning of July 19th. CrowdStrike made an update to its Falcon sensor software, but a bug caused the software to crash.
Officials in Europe were already getting a grasp on how bad the issue was. Germany's cybersecurity chief warned people it would be a long day.
Systems running Microsoft Windows crashed, resulting in the largest outage in world history. The results were devastating and disrupted nearly all aspects of daily life, upending banks, hospitals, air transport, and retail. It just goes to show how fragile our tech-heavy existence truly is.
Ambulance services across the country have reported a surge in demand as a result.
But if you have an urgent problem, you should contact your own GP surgery, either in person or by telephone.
Prematurely clearing the fire site. In the 1970s, Luna Park, Sydney was one of Australia's most popular amusement parks. A top attraction in the park was the Ghost Train. The disorienting ride took passengers through a dark, winding tunnel full of spine-chilling special effects. Night after night, park-goers enjoyed the thrilling ride. But on June 9, 1979, something went terribly wrong. Multiple people noticed an odd smell and what looked like real fire.
We decided to have a second go in the Ghost Train. And as we're in there, I could distinctly smell the kerosene burning.
Soon, flames enveloped the ride, trapping several passengers inside. 7 people perished. The exact cause was unclear. However, the lead investigator quickly ruled out arson and concluded faulty wiring was to blame.
But within just half a day, the police hastily wrote the fire off as an electrical fault and bulldozed the scene.
The scene was cleared, leaving many questions unanswered and obliterating any chance of further investigation. Official handling of the case has been heavily criticized.
There was so much buried, so many facts distorted and hidden.
America escalating tensions in Vietnam.
It was a serious mistake for Kennedy to get involved as he did
with American force in that part of the world, thinking that this great monolithic Soviet-style communism would rule the roost, when he could have played it differently, I believe, and fought it more subtly.
The United States entered the Vietnam War following the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where North Vietnamese forces allegedly attacked the U.S. Navy in international waters. The event was framed as an unprovoked attack, but later evidence showed otherwise.
The great word the Vietnam War gave us was escalation, because it starts off with Kennedy sending in just 400 military advisors who are actually special forces, organizing and controlling the action, and then more go in.
While the first attack remains debated, the second one was entirely fabricated. It devolved into a brutal war, which dragged on for years, causing thousands of American and Vietnamese deaths. Along the way, the United States committed atrocious war crimes, such as the My Lai massacre. Ultimately, the war ended in failure, all spurred on by an incident with very little evidence.
He should have fought it with the limited aid he gave initially, with the development of the special forces, the Green Berets as they're called, and other small tactical units, and not created this great surge of North Vietnamese resentment.
Republics falling to tyranny. Democratic institutions are only as strong as a nation's willingness to keep it afloat. Instability and internal strife work hand in hand to bring democracies to their knees. The Roman and Weimar republics each struggled with political polarization, economic crises, and corruption. Discontent and distrust in institutions spread like viruses, weaponized by ambitious authoritarians. The Roman Republic's decline was marked by social unrest and economic inequality. Elites struggled for power. Amidst the chaos, Julius Caesar rose quickly and eventually established imperial rule. Likewise, the Weimar Republic was strangled by hyperinflation and factionalism.
From 620,000 marks to the dollar in August 1923 to 630 billion 3 months later.
Political extremists took advantage of the uncertainty and eventually seized power. In the end, Adolf Hitler rose to prominence, dominating both Germany and most of Europe. Russia invades Ukraine.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
8 years after annexing Crimea in 2014, Russia followed up with a full-fledged invasion of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin expected the war to end in a matter of days or hours. Instead, as of 2024, it is still dragging on. The death toll of Russian troops is staggering. Some estimates suggest that more than 100,000 soldiers have been killed.
Many of the casualties are now older fighters with little or no training. Significant numbers have also been recruited from prisons.
The attrition rate has forced Russia to conscript new fodder for the war machine. Economically, Russia faces severe sanctions and a crippling recession. Russia has been forced to seek economic aid and military armament from China and North Korea. Western aid to Ukraine has allowed their military in 2024 to launch the first significant military incursion into Russian territory since World War II.
Video shows a Ukrainian soldier driving through the bombed-out Russian countryside unchallenged, then celebrating driving back a Russian tank.
The attacks that created empires.
Though the raid only lasted 75 minutes, the Japanese destroyed or damaged nearly 20 American naval vessels, including 8 battleships and more than 340 airplanes.
Attacking first has often determined the outcome of a war. Some of those outcomes, though, were not so rosy for the attackers. In 1588, Spain's Armada set out to crush England's growing navy and restore Catholic rule, only to be slammed by powerful storms. Decimated, the survivors were ultimately outmaneuvered by England's smaller ships.
It's a sea battle that changed the balance of world power for 300 years.
Spain's attack led to England's centuries-long dominance over the seas. In 1941, Japan too sought to hamstring their naval rival. Their attack on Pearl Harbor was swift and devastating. It did not, however, deliver a crippling blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Instead, it galvanized America, dragging it into World War II.
On December 8, 1941, one day after the attack, the United States Congress declared war on Japan, officially entering World War II.
In each instance, the attacked nation went on to become the world's most formidable superpower. Titanic sinks after iceberg warnings are ignored.
Why are they turning?
Is it hard over?
It is, yes, sir, hard over.
Many mistakes were made that caused the Titanic to sink, so it's difficult to pinpoint just one. Perhaps the most consequential, though, was turning hard to starboard when they spotted the iceberg, which extended the collision, creating a large gash that flooded 5 compartments. Had they struck the iceberg head-on, the bow would have been crushed, but only 1 or 2 compartments would have flooded.
Note the time, enter it in the log.
What was that, Mr. Murdoch?
An iceberg, sir. I put her hard to starboard and ran the engines full of stern, but it was too close. I tried to port round it, but she hit.
In such an event, the ship could have survived, as it was built to still float with up to 4 flooded compartments. Also, it only carried 20 lifeboats, enough for about half its passengers. The primary mistake that night was ignoring iceberg warnings and maintaining a high speed throughout. Changing just this one decision could likely have prevented the accident.
The pumps. If we open the doors...
The pumps buy you time, but minutes only. From this moment, no matter what we do, Titanic will founder.
Hitler's invasion of Russia. A British soldier's choice to spare the future Führer's life during World War I turned out to be a huge blunder. But we'd argue that the most dramatic mistake involving Adolf Hitler was one he made himself. Despite signing a non-aggression pact with Russia, Hitler still considered Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union his enemies. In June of 1941, the Germans invaded Russia. Despite committing the largest invasion force in history, the Germans were unprepared for the Soviet scorched earth tactics or the bleak Russian winter, and they experienced over 500,000 casualties. The offensive split and depleted the German forces, and put Russia on the side of the Allies, which likely lost Hitler the war. Treaty of Versailles harsh terms.
If you think of September the 11th, but then you think of September the 11th style casualties every day for 4 years, then you begin to get some kind of feeling of what the sort of trauma was that existed in the Western countries and the Allied countries at the time, particularly in Britain and in France, which had never known levels of casualties of the kind that they'd experienced between 1914 and 1918.
The Treaty of Versailles was a deal signed in 1919 at the end of World War I, which mainly focused on weakening the German Empire. Despite the Austrian-Hungarian Empire being the main instigators, the victorious powers primarily blamed Germany.
We were journeying to Paris, not merely to liquidate the war, but to found a new order in Europe. We were preparing not peace only, but eternal peace. There was about us the halo of some divine mission. We must be alert, stern, righteous, and ascetic, for we were bent on doing great, permanent, and noble things.
They had to accept full responsibility for starting the war, and were made to pay enormous reparations. This crippled their economy, and fostered resentment towards the victorious powers, which eventually led to Hitler's rise to power and World War II. If the Allies had adopted a less punitive approach, like the US did to Japan after World War II, the devastating Second War and the rise of Nazi Germany might have been alternate history.
For 6 months, it was the closest we have ever had to a world government, and I don't suspect we'll ever have anything like it again. You can imagine all the most powerful people in the world here, prime ministers, kings, presidents, foreign secretaries, plus all the people who came because they were here.
Mao's Great Leap Forward.
I saw Russian cars, which the Chinese have begun to make. There were wood-burning buses of the type I had seen in Europe during the war. Vehicles of all kinds. In most places of the city, there was a good traffic control system.
Mao Zedong was the founder of Communist China, who became leader of the CCP during the Long March, a pivotal event in the Second Sino-Japanese War. After Japan's defeat, he sought to industrialize China and finally recover from the century of humiliation. He believed rapid industrialization would help them catch up to the West, but it turned into a catastrophic failure.
Here, oil is extracted from coal. Built in 1928 by the Japanese, destroyed during the war, it was restored and enlarged. The Japanese produced 225,000 tons of petroleum in their best year. 1957 production was 320,000 tons. 1958 goal, 440,000 to catch up with Britain.
The plan was overly optimistic and resulted in mass famine and an economic collapse. By 1962, Mao faced criticism for his policies and was sidelined at the 7,000 Cadres Conference. This didn't last long, though, as just 4 years later, he kickstarted the Cultural Revolution, which allowed him to reclaim full control of the nation.
Coal comes from the Fushun mines. The plant also has its own department store, canteen, and club. Built during the Japanese occupation, The plant has been restored and enlarged following wartime destruction. All kinds of steel products are made.
The American invasion of Iraq.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
The 2003 U.S.-led invasion of Iraq was driven by the deadly combination of misleading claims and poor assumptions. The U.S. government convinced their allies that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and had links to terrorism.
There was no link between 9/11 and Iraq, so the Bush administration began manufacturing justifications.
The Bush administration's assertions were later proven false. No WMDs were ever found, nor was any evidence linking Iraq to al-Qaeda. By some estimates, the invasion led to over 1 million deaths and casualties, as well as widespread destruction and regional instability. The U.S. invasion also ultimately played a crucial role in the rise of ISIS. The economic cost to Americans is hard to pin down, though some experts believe that the war cost taxpayers between $1 and $2 trillion.
It changed the entire Middle East. In fact, it changed much of our world forever.
Caesar ignores warnings.
Senator Varenus, I come about your grandson, Lucius. And what I tell you now is the truth.
Julius Caesar is most famous for sowing the seeds of the Roman Empire, enslaving and slaughtering millions of Gauls, and giving the month of July its name. He was eventually assassinated in 44 BC, which shouldn't have come as a surprise since he was given several warnings about it.
If I may, gracious Caesar, you were going to consider revoking my brother's exile.
I'm still considering it. Take your hand off me.
What are you waiting for? No! No! No!
All of these were dismissed, leading to his death in the Senate, where he was stabbed 23 times. A soothsayer warned him to beware the Ides of March, the eventual date he was killed. His wife Calpurnia had a dream of his death and insisted he stay home, but he dismissed her fears. Ultimately, his trusted friend Brutus convinced him to come in, which turned out to be the dictator's final mistake.
So you see, the tyrant is dead, the republic is restored, and you are alone. Would you like some honey water? I won't. Thank you.
AOL buys Time Warner.
What you will come to know, as we know instinctively, that there is a natural fit between these two companies.
In the year 2000, the dot-com bubble was at its height, and it didn't look like anything would slow down the meteoric rise of the internet.
Well, pretty clearly, if you looked at last Friday, the market cap of AOL was twice the size of Time Warner. I've made a judgment, which I believe to be correct, that going forward, the Time Warner shareholders will be much better off owning 45% of AOL Time Warner than 100% of Time Warner.
Ultimately, the internet's development didn't slow down, but the stock market did, leading to a recession. One of the biggest casualties was the merger of AOL and Time Warner in 2000, which even at the time was viewed by many as being a ridiculous idea.
But things didn't turn out as planned. From the very beginning, the merged company failed to live up to its lofty financial expectations. To make matters worse, technology stocks that had been thriving in the 90s suddenly fell off a cliff with the burst of the internet bubble.
AOL spent a whopping $182 billion on merging with Time Warner, but years on, the company split again. Today, Time Warner remains a major player in the media business, and while AOL still exists, it's dead in the water. Oh, how the tables turned.
Is that the biggest regret of your life?
What?
Having all your money tied up in Time Warner.
No, I would have liked to see that merger not happen.
NASA ignores Challenger warnings.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
In 1986, NASA launched the shuttle Challenger, which tragically exploded only 73 seconds after liftoff. The event occurred during a cold morning, which caused the ship's rubber O-rings to stiffen, leading to a fuel leak that ignited the vessel. All 7 crew members perished, marking one of the darkest moments in the history of space exploration.
Engines at 65%.
100%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%. Challenger, go at throttle up.
Months earlier, several engineers, including Roger Beaujolais, had warned of an impending failure due to the O-ring's vulnerability to cold. Beaujolais even wrote a memo outlining this issue, but his concerns were completely ignored. Although a team was formed to address the problem, they lacked adequate support, and the launch proceeded, only to end disastrously, like Beaujolais predicted. Moctezuma II welcomes the Spanish.
Cortez's legacy is a complex one. On one hand, he is the conqueror of Mexico. He brought and extended the Spanish Empire. But from the indigenous point of view, he was a mass murderer.
Moctezuma II, the Aztec emperor, received Hernán Cortés and his conquistadors in 1519 with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. According to some historians, Moctezuma, influenced by a prophecy suggesting that a god would return in the form of a pale-skinned man, initially saw the Spaniards as divine. Cortés, he thought, could be the incarnation of the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl. He sought to appease them by offering gifts and hospitality, believing this would prevent conflict.
Cortés was motivated by these treasures and continued towards the city. He later wrote, "Moctezuma came to greet us, and with him some 200 lords, all barefoot and dressed in a different costume."
Instead, his decision invited invasion. Cortés and his men exploited Moctezuma's hospitality to gather intelligence, gain political leverage, and incite dissent among the Aztecs. The Spaniards spread disease and formed alliances with rivals to the Aztecs.
This alliance would be crucial for Cortés, as the Tlaxcalteca helped him navigate the landscape, served as translators, and urged the defeat of Moctezuma.
Combined with their superior weaponry, they easily conquered the Aztec Empire completely by 1521. A B-Day helped lose D-Day. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched an ambitious operation to retake Western Europe. Known as D-Day, the first landings occurred on the beaches of Normandy, France. The casualties were high, but the operation granted the Allies a foothold that would eventually lead to victory on the Western Front. However, things could have gone very differently. The Germans' most accomplished general, Erwin Rommel, was in charge of defending the Atlantic Wall against an invasion. However, he had decided to take leave, as the 6th was his wife's birthday. And German meteorologists had mistakenly predicted storms for another few weeks, making a seaborne invasion unlikely. Had Rommel been in command, the Allies may never have gotten a beachhead to retake France, failing to secure JonBenet Ramsey's crime scene. On Christmas Day 1996, JonBenet Ramsey was found dead in the basement of her family's home in Boulder, Colorado.
We were kidnapping. Hurry, please. Explain to me what's going on. Are you Kathy Ramsey? I'm the mother.
The case sparked a media frenzy and generated worldwide attention. For decades, investigators and amateur sleuths have tried to unravel the mystery of who killed the child beauty queen. Unfortunately, the initial investigation is riddled with errors. The most critical mistake occurred as soon as the police arrived. They failed to secure the crime scene.
The police should have secured that scene by telling everybody, get out. I'm sorry, this is a crime scene.
Police also neglected to take statements from JonBenet's parents right away, even though they were behaving in a manner the officers considered unusual.
They didn't want to talk to the police. They lawyered up right away.
The Ramseys agreed to give handwriting, hair, and blood samples. Still, they refused formal interviews with the police.
A series of additional mistakes followed. The Boulder police acknowledged these early errors. However, the investigation suffered as a result, and the case remains unsolved. The Tenerife airport disaster.
Look at it out there. I mean, this cloud just rolled right onto us. I don't think anybody has the minimums now.
This disaster on Spain's Canary Islands in March 1977 remains the deadliest accident in aviation history, costing 583 lives. Los Rodeos airport was congested due to a bomb explosion at Gran Canaria. Exacerbating this was a dense fog rolling into the airport. KLM Flight 4805 took off in the fog and crashed into Pan Am Flight 1736, which was still taxiing on the runway.
It feels great to be alive. I'd be lying if I said anything else.
An investigation found that the accident resulted from critical miscommunication between KLM captain Jakob Feldhausen von Santen and air traffic control. Ambiguous and non-standard wording led Feldhausen von Santen to commence takeoff without proper clearance, resulting in the tragic collision.
When I got out on the ground, I could hear people screaming and yelling and all. Within about 5 minutes, you heard absolutely nothing. There was no noise at all.
Russia sold Alaska. During the 19th century, the Crimean War caused several countries to begin exerting pressure on Russia through blockades of their sea routes. Because of this, they were unable to properly supply their largest overseas territory, Alaska. To offset this, in 1867, Russia sold the territory to the United States for $7.2 million. While it may have been a smart move at the time for Russia, in retrospect, it's often seen as a mistake, as the gold and oil discovered in Alaska far exceeds the value it sold for. Not only that, but Russia having a foothold in the North American continent would have caused the Cold War to play out very differently. Rushed engineering collapsing dams. If history has taught us anything, it's that greed and hubris are often at the heart of human tragedies. The Johnstown flood, St. Francis Dam failure, and Banshao Dam disaster were a trio of foreseeable catastrophes.
With every passing minute, the internal stresses on the dam were multiplying. At around 11:20 p.m., the structure finally began to give way.
In each case, flawed engineering, poor oversight, and disregard for safety warnings set the stage for massive loss of life. The Johnstown flood occurred when a poorly maintained dam collapsed, destroying entire towns.
And water is such a powerful force, it would pick up locomotives off of the track that were in this flood's way and bulldoze everything that was in its way.
Similarly, the St. Francis Dam in California failed due to structural flaws, flooding communities downstream. In China, the Banshao Dam was overwhelmed by unprecedented rainfall. This exacerbated problems stemming from design failures and political mismanagement, causing the dam to collapse, killing thousands. Though decades apart, these disasters highlight the repeated risk of underestimating nature's power. A mistranslation may have caused America's nuclear attacks.
The U.S. had a choice: an invasion of Japan requiring 1 million troops or a top-secret weapon. The Japanese were given an ultimatum: surrender or suffer dire consequences.
After the fall of Hitler's Germany, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. The declaration came with a warning: refusal would result in, quote, prompt and utter destruction. The culture of Imperial Japan couldn't tolerate public consideration of surrender. They responded with a statement including the word mokusatsu. The Allies interpreted this as an outright rejection of the Potsdam Declaration. Mokusatsu, they believed, meant to ignore with silent contempt. They acted accordingly, dropping 2 nuclear bombs.
When we came back after the surrender, we came back to the same area, and the whole city was completely flat. It was really devastating to see.
However, some believe Foreign Minister Togo was counseling circumspection and patience. He hoped that the Soviets would mediate a better deal. In the years after the nuclear attack on Japan, people have argued that by mokusatsu, Japanese leaders just meant, quote, withholding comment.
Truman claimed he never lost a night of sleep over his decision, and to this day the United States has never apologized for it. Still, the horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki firmly cemented atomic bombs as the world's weapons of absolute last resort.
The Great Depression and the Great Recession. Time and time again, America and the world pay the price for a cycle of laissez-faire economics and deregulation. In the 1920s, minimal government oversight allowed for rampant speculation and risky investments in the stock market. By the end of the decade, the stock market crashed and spread economic devastation around the world.
Wherever you looked, boys and girls were, men and women, were wondering what was ever going to happen to them.
Similarly, in the early 2000s, decades of financial deregulation enabled irresponsible lending practices. The housing market was utterly poisoned by subprime mortgages, leading to a bubble that burst in 2008.
The Federal Reserve has moved quickly to bring order to the financial markets.
Both crises were fueled by the belief that markets could self-regulate. Unchecked greed and the erosion of safeguards created systemic risks. The resultant unemployment, widespread foreclosures, and economic collapse reflected the dangers of prioritizing short-term profits over long-term stability. The Salem witch trials and the Second Red Scare. Democracy may be a net good, but majoritarianism, if left unchecked and under the right circumstances, can cause mass hysteria.
There were witchcraft outbreaks all the time, all through the colonies, especially the northern colonies.
crimes. With a dash of fear and a pinch of paranoia, bad actors could use a desire to root out perceived threats to cause great harm. In Salem, Massachusetts, accusations of witchcraft spiraled out of control. Witch trials led to executions based on flimsy evidence and fear of the supernatural.
Angry community members in Salem pointed fingers at assertive middle-aged women, but also began to accuse married women from well-respected families. Some men, and even a 4-year-old child, were also accused of being witches.
Centuries later, Senator Joe McCarthy spearheaded his own witch hunt, this time for communists. Those accused of subversion were blacklisted and persecuted, often without real evidence.
The second Red Scare perhaps took its greatest toll on artists and entertainers, people like Paul Robeson, Arthur Miller, and others who were unable to work because of being branded as suspected communists.
In both cases, authorities used public fear to conduct aggressive and unjust campaigns against alleged enemies, ruining lives in the process and fostering deep societal distrust. Stalin's terror famine.
In terms of ruthlessness, bloodlust, Stalin remains one of the greatest villains of the 20th century.
To this day, the Holodomor is considered one of the greatest tragedies of Ukrainian history.
A term meaning death by starvation. It was genocide.
From 1932 to 1933, Joseph Stalin pushed a brutal campaign of forced collectivization and grain requisitioning in Soviet Ukraine. Unfortunately, the country was already in the middle of a food shortage, exacerbated by Stalin's policies.
Records show the Soviets took over 4 million tons of grain from Ukraine alone in 1932. That same year, a new law punished anyone who took even a handful of grain or was caught hiding grain or bread with 10 years in prison or the death penalty.
As a result, Ukraine fell into a terrible famine. By the end of 1933, somewhere between 3.5 and 5 million Ukrainians perished due to hunger and related diseases.
In the fall and winter of 1932, Soviet police began seizing not just grain, but anything edible, even livestock.
Stalin refused to provide aid, although Russia continued to export grain. The Holodomor devastated Ukrainian agriculture and local economies, ripping families to pieces and traumatizing a nation. Apollo 13.
Houston, we have a problem.
The basis of a blockbuster movie starring Tom Hanks, Apollo 13 was destined for the moon in 1970, but it never made it.
It was plagued by bad omens and bad luck from the very beginning.
Thankfully, unlike many other space failures like the high-profile Challenger and Columbia disasters in 1986 and 2003 respectively, the astronauts in Apollo 13 all survived. The problem was that an oxygen tank had been damaged long before its installation in the spacecraft, which was described as a, quote, bomb by Commander Jim Lovell.
I looked at my companions and I said, you know, every flight has a crisis. Something always goes wrong. This happened early in the flight, and we're now free and clear of any other things going wrong.
That bomb went off, severely damaging the craft when it was already in space. The crew had to move into the lunar module so they would survive, and then loop around the moon to return to Earth. Trojans bring in the horse.
What is this? An offering to Poseidon. The Greeks are praying for a safe return home. This is a gift. We should take it to the temple of Poseidon.
I think we should burn it.
Burn it, my prince. It's a gift to the god.
This was a mistake so monumental it became a metaphor for deception that is still widely used today. The ancient city of Troy was first destroyed around 1200 BC, and again by archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century. According to legend, the Greeks built a giant wooden horse, hid soldiers in it, and presented it to the Trojans as a gift.
Helen, we must go. Where? I'll show you. Now, hurry. Paris. It's a long way, quick. We must go now.
Believing it to be a symbol of victory, the Trojans brought it into their city, only for Greek soldiers to emerge and decimate Troy. The tale's authenticity remains heavily debated, with no direct evidence. However, oral history played a central role in the ancient world, which preserved surprisingly truthful elements, suggesting that this tale may have been inspired by real-life events.
Let Troy burn! Burn it! Burn it all! Burn Troy!
Pandemic response.
The COVID-19 pandemic continues to grow. So are the parallels being drawn between it
and another deadly virus that struck the globe more than a century ago.
Human civilization has been ravaged by deadly pandemics over and over throughout history. The Spanish flu and COVID-19 happened a century apart, but it seems that not everyone chose to learn from the past. Discontent with public health measures spread widely during each pandemic, exacerbating the situation.
Spirits will not die, and I tell you what, we will not comply!
Governments implemented shutdowns to curb the spread, but uneven compliance and politicized responses prolonged the crises. During the Spanish flu, anti-mask leagues and public pushback against restrictions mirrored the protests and skepticism surrounding COVID-19 measures. The Spanish flu eventually subsided as the virus mutated into less lethal strains, whereas COVID-19's global impact was mitigated by vaccines and evolving public health strategies. A wrong turn started World War I. One of the most famous killings of all time. The assassination of Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand is usually credited with being the catalyst for World War I. But what some may not know is that it could have been avoided, if not for a wrong turn. The Archduke had already survived one assassination attempt with a bomb by the same group while visiting Sarajevo. On the return journey, the Archduke's drivers, who spoke Czech, couldn't understand their directions for a new route and took a wrong turn. When they stopped to reorient, it was right next to one of the assassins, who promptly pulled out a gun and shot both Ferdinand and his wife. Human atrocities.
For 100 days in 1994, the African country of Rwanda suffered a horrific campaign of mass murder.
The Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide shared chilling similarities in both their origins and outcomes. Both were driven by deeply ingrained ethnic hatred, propaganda, and political manipulation.
When out in public, Jews were ordered to wear a yellow star, a Jewish religious symbol, so that they could be easily told apart from non-Jews. The Nazis told Germans that those wearing the star were enemies of the people.
The Nazis systematically dehumanized Jews through years of anti-Semitic rhetoric. Eventually, they industrialized their bigotry, killing upwards of 12 million people, half of them Jewish. In Rwanda, the Tutsi minority was demonized by extremist Hutu leaders. After riling up that hatred to a fever pitch, the killing began. In just 100 days, Hutus slaughtered more than 500,000 Tutsis.
Tutsi victims sought refuge at churches and schools, where they hoped international organizations would protect them. But no outside party came to their aid.
Both genocides were marked by the use of state machinery to orchestrate mass murder, while other nations stood by, either complicit or indifferent. Both massacres left profound scars and a haunting legacy of loss. Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into your settings and switch on notifications. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster.
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened. The Soviet version is this. One of the atomic reactors at the Chernobyl atomic power plant near the city of Kiev was damaged, and there is speculation in Moscow that people were injured and may have died.
Chernobyl's meltdown was the most destructive nuclear disaster in history and could have been completely avoided if the proper procedures were followed. The disaster was immediately caused by a safety test, which was meant to be carried out during the day with a trained crew. Instead, the untrained night crew did the test, with very little time to prepare and properly carry it out.
The TMI accident was nothing compared with this. I would speculate that it was very serious, and the reason for that is that they've observed radiation levels 10 times normal from Finland all the way down to Stockholm.
The Soviets were also secret about their nuclear technology, withholding important information from operators and engineers who should have understood them. After the explosion, further mistakes were made, like the nearby town of Pripyat not being evacuated until over a full day later. It was the perfect storm of mistakes, leading to one of humanity's worst disasters.
You can be sure that the decision to disclose was made at the very highest level, undoubtedly by Gorbachev himself, and probably it took several days for the Soviet leaders to decide how to handle it.
What do you think was the most impactful mistake a human ever made? Let us know in the comments below.
He'd rather burn his own city than negotiate with me. I didn't think he had the courage.
Did you enjoy this video? Check out these other clips from WatchMojo, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.